If you're an educator and you've ever thought, "Ugh, I know that my students really need to talk about what's happening in the world right now, but I'm worried that it'll turn into an argument or get out of control," then you're not alone. And this video is for you. Today, I'm going to give you a clear, usable framework for organizing a dialogue, not a debate, around a divisive issue, whether it's about something in the news or something happening in your community. I've developed this approach over more than a decade of facilitating conversations on hard topics in schools and organizations, often in moments of crisis when a community wanted to engage in honest dialogue without fueling division. And if you want to go deeper in practicing dialogic education, there's a link below to join the waitlist for my upcoming workshop, which I'll tell you about at the end of the video. So to introduce this dialogue framework, I'm going to start with a visual. It's a very fancy visual. It is a sheet of graph paper. So I want you to imagine that this sheet of graph paper represents a complex issue. Each tiny square represents a way of understanding it. So, when we're exploring a topic, we can walk around this whole terrain to understand it better. But here's what happens when an issue becomes really divisive and it's platformed as a culture war. We start to hear only about one particular version constantly. This version floods media headlines and political talking points and online arguments. But here's the kicker. This version just represents one tiny square. It's narrow and it's oversimplified, but since it's the loudest, it starts to feel like the only legitimate way to discuss an issue. And eventually, everyone gets pulled into arguing inside that one tiny green square. Once we are inside of this square, this dominant framing, we often forget that there's a whole landscape around it that we could be exploring. Because inside this box, the conversation doesn't allow for any curiosity. It's literally only built for debate. So the first move in facilitating dialogue is really to recognize and name that conversation that has collapsed into that little box and invite people to step outside of it, to have the space to see things differently. So now let's get into how we would structure a conversation that allows us to wander around the graph paper. The first big principle is to name a broader question, okay? The one that is framing the entire graph paper. A dialogue can really begin when we pose a larger question that all the participants can explore together. If you're familiar with Paulo Freire's problem-posing model of education, then this will sound really familiar. Let me give you a couple examples of what this might look like using a controversial topic. So the dominant discourse inside this green square might ask, are undocumented immigrants making our communities unsafe? But the broader question could be, what is making our communities unsafe? Or how do we ensure safety in our communities? Make sense? Okay, here's another. The dominant discourse might be asking, should trans people be allowed to play sports? But the broader underlying question could be, what is making sports unfair? Or how do we make sports more fair? And you can think of this with issues on a smaller scale too. They don't have to be like on national news. Maybe there's a debate in your institution around should phones be allowed in school? And it's gotten so loud that it's subsumed every other conversation that's relevant when we think of the larger problem we want to solve, which might be, how do we keep students engaged in learning throughout the day? So dialogue becomes possible when we place the broader question, not the narrow debate, at the center. Once we've named the bigger question, the next step is to invite participants to explore it through their lived experience. Not by sharing their opinions, but by sharing their values, their memories, and their stories. Freire emphasized that problem-posing education takes people's historicity as their starting point. To go back to our example, if our grounding question is, how do we create safe communities? Then we might start by asking, in the past, what has made you feel safe in a community and why? Who taught you the most about safety growing up? How do you define safety? How do you define community? This step restores complexity that the dominant framing, the framing inside of this green square, erased. Inside that green square, safety has one meaning and one solution. But lived experience shows us that safety is layered and unequal and shaped by people's identities and context. Starting here also positions participants as knowledge holders and builds engagement and trust. The third big principle is to map the wider landscape. Once the room is really grounded in lived experience, then we can start naming the other squares on that graph paper. So that's all the systems, the histories, the identities, and the different contexts that shape the topic. And the great thing is that by the time we get to this point, the participants have already started identifying all of these through stories. For example, when I facilitated a dialogue grounded in the question, how do we make sports more fair? One of the students shared this heartfelt story about how their dream was pursuing gymnastics, but they weren't able to because their parents couldn't afford it. So by this point, students really quickly surfaced that class and access to resources were a key part of solving this problem, which is something that the dominant discourse erases pretty much entirely. And so this allows the conversation to stay really grounded and meaningful rather than getting too abstract or theoretical, which is often where arguments can start. And this is also where we can introduce curated materials like data, news clips, maps, short readings even, not as answers, but as additional ways to understand the issue. Finally, the fourth principle is to look at the dominant frame. So only after exploring the wider landscape do we return to this little polarizing square that takes up a lot of space. But, and this is really important, we are not stepping inside of it because this would pull us into a debate. We're only examining it from out here. And we're noticing what the square does. So questions to ask the group here might sound like, why do we think that this framing is the whole conversation? Why are we all being funneled into it? Is this actually the central issue? Why or why not? Who benefits when the conversation stays here, both ideologically and materially? And conversely, who is harmed when this conversation becomes the default? What perspectives and solutions disappear when we only engage with the issue in this one way? Now students can see that square not as all of reality, but as a frame that limits and shapes what realities are visible. So those are the four principles. And dialogue isn't a magic wand, but it is one of the most powerful tools we have to help students think for themselves and think beyond the narrow options that dominant narratives offer to them. So if you're thinking, I want to actually try this in my context, then make sure to check out the link to the waitlist of my workshop. Once enough people are on it, then I'll open up registration and the first group will get a very generous discount. And if you want a PDF to further support this approach that I just outlined, I created a document to help you move conversations from debate to dialogue, and all these same steps are on it. This hopefully goes without saying, but there is no one size fits all. This is a framework or a way of understanding issues that I come back to every single time I facilitate a dialogue, and one that I've just found hugely helpful ever since I identified it and really boiled it down to these four principles. I have several other videos that act as great companion videos to this one, so I'll put them in the description box. With all that said, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in my next video.